So once again, thank you very much for coming along to this very special event. And we're very privileged to have Professor Robert Hill from Department of Ecology and Environmental Biology at the University of Adelaide. And we were chatting earlier because I have just taken on a little bit of a role with a group called One Tree Per Child. And we've just started to do a partnership with Koala Life, and that foundation has just got themselves a new chair, which so happens to be Bob. And they were telling me how different it is to work with animals and plants. So, I'm sure Bob will talk a bit more about how we can work with plants in his presentation. So we advertised this talk as climate change and vegetation responses, as our climate is now changing at an unprecedented pace and the impacts will be severe. What should we do? There are some clear answers that will help us to be prepared for what is coming. Thank you very much for coming. Professor Bob Hill.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. That's good for me. All right, well, firstly, thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to come and labour you with my views. I'm a paleontologist by training, so this isn't naturally my space. But a few years ago, it became clear to me that in the university system in South Australia, there's no one working in this space with plants, and it was a really obvious gap. So I started filling in that gap, and several years later I'm still doing so because we still don't have anyone with the right expertise to deal with these issues in our universities, which is disgraceful, frankly. But that's how it is. So what I'm going to do is give you my take on climate change, the impact it's going to have, has had and is going to have in Adelaide, and some of the things we can do about it. This is not a happy story for a lot of it. I'm sorry it's come along to be entertained. It's not entertaining, it's grim. And what we need to do about it is quite stark. So it's a series of observations really, and I hope there's some theme to it as we go. So let's see how we get on. I start with this slide because many years ago now, I was in New Zealand being taken on a guided tour, and in the North Island we came, this is in February, to Mount Ruapehu, and that's fog you can see there. It was a miserable day. You can also see the big overhanging basalt there from volcanoes in the past, and it's a very steep track there, and you can see it's pretty narrow track. And I was taken to the sign that you can see just on the left-hand side there, and it was this. This was a really interesting take on occupational health and safety, and it's a probability statement. It's really telling you if you get through here fast, the chances of being hit by falling rock is relatively low, so you'll be okay. And I was, because I'm here. But it was quite an interesting statement. I use this with undergraduate students to try and begin to talk about probability. So where are we in relation to that? There's extreme weather events coming. We can't avoid them, but we can try and plan to lessen their impact. And the thing that's really disturbing about this is how extreme the extreme might be. So the current focus on climate change globally is to try and retain temperature within the bounds of 1.5 to 3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. In my view, there is absolutely no chance that that's going to happen. That's a grim assessment, but if you look at that graph underneath, there's been about 3 degrees of change in the last century, and there's no indication that it's getting slower. If anything, it's still increasing. But this isn't the major problem. It's an interesting thing with climate change. When it first started getting talked about, I think, people were talking about 1, 2, 3 degrees, and I think almost everybody had the view that if you added 1 or 2 or 3 degrees to the maximum temperature every day, what's the problem? I mean, that sounds quite pleasant if you live in most places. But that's not the issue. That's not where the big issue comes, and I'll explain what that is. So what I've done here is taken 2 graphs out of the climate record for Adelaide. So you can go to the Bureau of Meteorology and see what the daily maximum temperature was for every day for about the last 120 years. And I've taken 2 years here, 2018 and 1970. 2018 was a relatively warm year, 1970 was a relatively cool year, and if you look at them there, their mean annual temperature is about 3 degrees apart. So I'm using this as a representation of what it's like to be 3 degrees apart, given that's the climate change we're looking at. I'm not suggesting that this represents that, it just gives an indication of how it might be. So there's the 2 graphs. You've got the number of days at each of the maximum temperatures, and you can see the maximum temperatures varied from about 11 or 12 degrees up to about 45 degrees through that time. And then you can see that the number of days, obviously, that hit those temperatures varied. If I put a very rough line of best fit against those 2 graphs, you get something like that. So the blue one is the warmer year, 2018. The green one is the cooler year, 1970. And the difference is a bit under 3 degrees centigrade across those years. And again, you can see that the peaks in those graphs are not too far apart, and in fact, if you put them in there, they're about 3 degrees apart, which fits neatly with the story. And almost all the attention on climate change has focused on that maximum and where those graphs are about 3 degrees apart. But have a look what happens up at the top end. In the cool year, you've got 1 day above 40 degrees. In the hot year, you've got 11 days above 40 degrees. And that's where the action really happens with climate change. It's at the extremes. So between 2 years that are 3 degrees apart, you've got a more than 10-fold difference in the number of days over 40 degrees. Now, in Western Europe, there's been some stunningly bad extreme heat events. And I put a couple of quotes in here. The first one is particularly important, I think. I won't read the whole thing out, but a heat wave in Europe in 2003 is estimated to have killed more than 70,000 people. And that's in 2003, so it's been a lot worse since then. And yet, I mean, who knew that number? Any of you aware of that? No, isn't that interesting? That 70,000 people can die and it doesn't get a big press. And the second quote, climate scientists have long warned that heat waves will strike more frequently and with higher temperatures as the world warms, but the future has arrived faster than the researchers have feared. So the climate modellers are very smart people, but they're not perfect, and modelling is a very difficult process, and they've got it wrong. It's happening quicker than they anticipated. And just at risk of being a bit controversial, but it's on my slides, so I have to do it. I looked this up. In the Ukraine, it's estimated that there's been 9,614 people, civilians, killed in the war, and 17,535 injuries. That's appalling, and none of us are going to say that's a good thing, but compare that to the 70,000 people that die in a heat wave, and which one gets the big press? And that tells you so much about the human condition and what matters to us, what's in our face, and what we'll react to at any particular moment. So if you look at these extremes, and again, I've gone to the Northern Hemisphere because while things have been getting particularly grim in the Northern Hemisphere, we've had a series of quite cool summers in the Southern Hemisphere. So here's what's happened in the UK, and this is quite startling. In each of these maps represents a peak in summer temperatures, the worst they'd had. So you start in 1976, and if you read the key at the bottom, 1976 was a bad year because it got into the low 30s in southern England. 2003 was a bad year because it got into the high 30s in the southeast. 2019 was a little bit worse. And then you've got the 2 days in 2022. 18th of July was pretty bad, but look at the 19th of July. You're up into the low 40s. So in about 50 years, it's increased about 10 degrees in terms of the maximum temperature that's been reached in the UK. And no wonder they were so poorly prepared for an event like that. There's been a lot of work done on the impact of climate on diseases. I don't particularly want to dwell on this. I'm interested particularly in heat waves, and I'm going to talk about that in terms of plants a little bit later. You can see in this graph that heat waves occurs right down near the bottom. When you're talking about diseases, that's because they're such short impact events. So it doesn't really show, but that graph does give you an indication of just what can come around as a result of climate change in terms of human health. And of course, we're now starting to see things like this. This goes back to the bad fires a few years ago and the smoke haze that drifted across Sydney. And when things like this happen, people really do start to take notice about their individual health. It's a little bit like what happened with COVID. COVID potentially impacted every one of us. So every one of us reacted. We didn't all react the same way, but we all reacted. Because it was personal and it was absolutely immediate. That's what it takes to get human attention. And of course there's papers like this coming out now, which are quite alarming, showing that the decline in global water is much more significant in the southern hemisphere than it is in the northern hemisphere. And I think we're about to start to see the impact of that as we go back into more normal summer cycles. There's a lot of interesting work being done, and India is one of the places that's really getting into this. This is quite an interesting paper that was only published a few days ago in Science, I think. And it's quite interesting reading what they're doing, and I think it does say something about the kind of society you live in. That in India, they're focusing on planting trees, they're focusing on painting their roofs white, they're focusing on building bigger porches. They're doing the practical things that make a difference. They're not trying to do the really big scale things, which I think is probably where our governments will head when they finally get the message. So let me show you something about our climate history in Adelaide. This again is the Bureau of Meteorology data for Adelaide. And I went through and counted them all up, and this is in groups of 10 years. So it starts at the left in the 1890s, goes through the 1900s until you get to 2000 up towards the right, and then into the 2010s. So what I did was for every decade, I counted up how many days were above 35 degrees. And you can see that through the 1900s till about the middle of the 1900s, there's a slight decline in the number of days above 35 degrees. And then it goes on a reasonably steep increase through to the present. Now, as someone who grew up in Adelaide, if I was asked without seeing any data at all, was it hotter when you were growing up or is it hotter now? My recollection would be it was hotter when I was growing up. I mean, summers seemed to go forever. It was great being young in those years. That's not true. That's not the reality of how it was. That's the reality right there. It's getting much hotter now than it was then. But our brains don't accept information like that, and that's one of the problems we have with something like climate change, is that there's a great deal of denial about the reality of what's really going on. But if you think this is right, this is the graph for days above 42 degrees. So the numbers are much lower, obviously, because we're only looking at 42 degrees here. So you can see through the 1900s, it was actually declining down to the point where in the 1970s, there was only one day that got above 42 degrees for the entire decade. In the last decade, there were just about 40 days that went above 42 degrees. That's something to be really scared about. Now, let me talk a bit about why this has happened. I won't dwell on this, but I think it's important for where it takes you, and it's important for where Adelaide is heading in the immediate future. So this is me going back to being a paleontologist. This is the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere for the last 400,000 years as before. So this has been done by doing cores into the ice in Antarctica. They have annual growth rates, like a tree has. You can count them quite easily. And there's trapped air bubbles in the ice. You can go in and measure the carbon dioxide concentration in a single air bubble. This is extremely accurate data. So you can see that up until very recently, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was never above 280 parts per million. And that's relatively low historically, but that's the reality. And then you see that enormous spike at the end, which goes up over 400 parts per million, and that's the last 200 years. That's the Industrial Revolution. So when people say, you know, you need statistics to measure these things, no you don't. You just need to look at a graph like this. There's nothing magical about interpreting that. So why did this happen? And this might be a bit controversial, but I mean, it comes back to Adelaide, where we are now, and what we're trying to achieve. This is human population growth over the last couple of hundred years or so. The black line is the reality. Now, I did this quite a few years ago, so it's not quite in date. But the United Nations does estimates of what the population will look like in the future, and it goes from their pessimistic to their optimistic view, depending on how you see population as being good or bad. But you can see our population is going up very rapidly, and there are predictions that it could continue to do so, although there are good signs to show that it might be starting to slow on a global level. Now, if I take the carbon dioxide levels for the last 200 years and plot them on the same axes, the red line is the carbon dioxide levels. So is the carbon dioxide increase a human-caused phenomenon? Why is it that we have governments in Australia who still think that the best way forward is economic growth, which is driven by population growth? Why do we lose trees out of Adelaide at 75,000 a year because we're putting urban infill to stack more people in here who we don't need for any decent future? The sooner we can get into a circular economy that allows us to get off the ridiculous treadmill of population growth equaling economic growth, equaling prosperity, the better off we'll be. Now, that's nothing to do with plants, but that's my statement about our current governments and their incredible short-sightedness. So let's have a talk about plants. Carbon dioxide is important to plants. It's important because carbon dioxide is the fuel for photosynthesis. So plants take carbon dioxide and water, they use light as an energy source, and they produce simple sugars, which are their energy reserve, and they give off oxygen as a byproduct. If you look at a plant close up, they have tiny pores in the leaf surface. That's the blue diagram on the left. That's actually a photograph. You've got the pairs of kidney-shaped guard cells. They open and close depending on how much water is in the plant. And when they're open, they let carbon dioxide in. That means photosynthesis can happen. That produces sugars, gives off oxygen. The oxygen is lost through the stomates out into the atmosphere. And at the same time, the plant loses water vapour through the stomates because it can't avoid doing so. It doesn't want to, it just does. More plants die from drought than from any other cause, terrestrial plants. So the real trade-off that plants have is they've got to try and reduce the amount of water they're losing while keeping carbon dioxide coming in for photosynthesis. And the way they do that is one of the most brilliant pieces of evolutionary design. The stomates, the little kidney-shaped cells on the left, open up when they're full of water, and so the pore opens and the gas can exchange. But as the plant runs out of water, they close down. They become flaccid, they close against each other, the water stops being lost, carbon dioxide doesn't get in anymore, but the plant will survive under most circumstances when that happens. When things get too grim, that obviously breaks down, and I'll talk about that in a moment. if you look at the history of life on Earth, this is it in a nutshell. So that's the entire history of life, 3.8 billion years. And the important thing here is that that's a graph of the oxygen in the atmosphere. So the green line is the minimum estimate, the red line is the maximum estimate. So we were somewhere in between those two. And you can see that our current point, which is 20% roughly oxygen in the atmosphere, was only reached relatively recently. So if anyone offers you a time travel back in time on planet Earth, take an oxygen cylinder with you if you want to have a look around, because otherwise you won't survive. The oxygen in the atmosphere is a relatively recent phenomenon. It has all sorts of impacts. The only reason we have major fires is because oxygen levels are so high. If you drop the oxygen levels, fires can't burn. So that's a recent phenomenon as well. Relatively speaking, this is a long time period. Okay, so I'll move on. The more obvious catastrophic events that will impact us are extreme heat events, drought, fire, flood, frost, sea level rise, and a whole lot of other things. The map on the left-hand side you can download from the Bureau of Meteorology site. That's the median prediction for sea level in Adelaide at the end of this century. So I live at Grange, and my house will be underwater by about 40 centimetres at the end of this century. And the whole of West Lakes will be gone. If you want to look internationally, Shanghai will disappear. I mean, it's grim, and things will be done about this. You can imagine some decades from now, as a last-ditch resort, we'll be building barrages around Adelaide to keep some of this land dry. But this is the reality of what's coming at us, and it's freely available. And as I said, this is the median estimate, not the worst one. Some of these events that could happen are what's called a threshold crisis. A threshold crisis is one which builds up over time until it reaches a critical level. Droughts are a really good example. A drought doesn't happen from one day to the next. It takes a long time to build up, and it gets worse and worse. Sea level rise is another one. But then you have other crises which are called a point crisis, which just come out of nowhere and suddenly they're there in full blaze. And fire is an obvious one. Excuse me. Floods are another one, unless it's a flood like we had in the Murray last year, which was more of a threshold crisis because it was so slow. Or extreme heat events. They come out of nowhere pretty much. Those two different kinds of events need very different responses to them, but they can combine to cause really major issues, and that's one of the things I want to talk about here. The high temperature impact when we get extreme heat events is a threshold crisis. Species can move outside their optimal temperature, so I'll try to explain this. Most of the work that's been done on the impact of climate change on plants is that if you have a plant which grows best in a mean annual temperature of 20 degrees and it's going up to 23 degrees, that plant might not be quite as happy as it was at 20 degrees. That's where all the activity has been until the last few years. Now all of a sudden the impact of an extreme heat event is overlain on that, and an extreme heat event is a very different thing. If you get days approaching 50 degrees centigrade, it can kill a plant outright. It's not something that's going to take decades to develop, it just happens. So we've moved from being concerned about what happens, if you look at those graphs, what happens where the maximum days are, to what happens down where the arrow is at the extreme temperature events. Extreme heat is particularly a problem if you also have drought conditions, and that's sadly tailor-made for Adelaide. When we get extreme heat, we get drought. So the plants that are there are not just having to cope with the heat, they're having to cope with the fact that they probably don't have much water either. So why do we want trees? What's the point of having trees in urban areas? And a lot of people are asking that question at the moment and suggesting that they're not particularly important. They provide enormous shade from the sun. It really does make a big difference. There's been some estimates that it can be up to 20 degrees. Now, I doubt that would occur in Adelaide, But there are some environments where it can make that much difference to the temperature. You get shade, obviously, so you're not standing in the direct sun. You get cooling from the transpiration of water loss. As I said, plants release water as water vapour while they're photosynthesising. That cools the environment down. Not a lot, but it does have an impact. They provide habitats for a lot of species of animals, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I'm talking to you. And they're a good alternative to just a bare, harsh streetscape. So the really big question, and the one that's taken up a lot of my mind at the moment, is what are the right species to plant? We have a group of species already in the ground, but I think we can guarantee that most of them are not the right ones. And the problem with trees is there's such a long-term investment. If we decide today that we're going to change much of the landscape in Adelaide by planting new trees, it's probably a decade-long project, because you've got to source the new trees, you've got to check that they're the right ones to put in. We can't just guess that. You've got to then find the seed, get it germinated, get it propagated by thousands, and get them into the ground. Trees don't happen in a few weeks. It's a very long-term process. And of course, there's all kinds of other issues. We need species that are resilient to climate change, but then there's also the negatives that come with trees. As soon as you get severe storms, and severe storms will increase with climate change as well, then you get trees falling, you get branches falling, and you get all the bad press that sits around trees. I mean, eucalypts get particularly bad press about their capacity to drop large limbs, and they do sometimes, and sometimes that's with tragic consequences. But I would say this, the main reason why big eucalypts drop big branches is because most of the big trees we have are eucalypts. They're big enough and old enough that they have the branches ready to drop. There's nothing special about eucalypts with their branch drop. And also, if you have very good arborists, then the trees can be managed so that they are very unlikely to drop branches. When you start seeing people getting on their high horse about trees losing, or big trees losing branches, it's mostly nonsense. So we've done a little bit of work on this, and it leads us to some pretty stark conclusions. Back in 2019, not all that long ago, we had a day in December which was 46 degrees. It was just before the fires that we had, which took everybody's attention away, and then that was followed by a very mild summer and summers to follow with the sun. But in December 2019, we had 46 degrees. We knew it was going to be hot, so we went out and did quite a lot of measurements on trees, and we focused on the plane trees that were at the University of Adelaide because Adelaide City Council was particularly interested in how plane trees were going to react. So there's two photos of the same tree taken in the morning and in the afternoon. And those trees, those leaves there have been scorched. So that's direct heat damage. That's killing the leaf tissue. Plane trees are pretty good at coping with that. They will cope by dropping those leaves and pretty quickly growing new leaves. But I don't know what happens if the day after is 46 degrees and then the day after that. Eventually this will kill the tree. And it's interesting that in Sydney they're now on a major undertaking to get rid of their plane trees. So they've decided plane trees aren't the way to go, and I'll show you why that is a little bit later. But this is a very different issue to what it is that usually kills trees when they're droughted. This isn't what kills trees under normal circumstances in drought. There's another one that's even worse. There were ginkgos as well. Almost everything got scorched that day. I think it was partly because it was so early in the season and the leaves hadn't had time to toughen up yet, but it was pretty grim. And then you get trees like brachychitons. Brachychiton is currently becoming the #1 star as a new street tree in Adelaide. There's a lot of them around, and there's a lot more going in. There's a whole stack of them going in down Port Road. Not every brachychiton, but many of them, when you put it under heat stress and water stress, they drop their leaves. So that roadway there is underneath a brachychiton tree. It's been a hot day. The brachychiton has said, I'm out of here, and it just drops its leaves. The tree's fine. It's a summer deciduous tree. So, or you could even call it drought deciduous. So when it gets hit with drought, its response is drop the leaves, go into hibernation, wait for good conditions, and then it'll come back. Is that a good tree to put in an urban environment? It's not going to have any leaves as soon as it had one decent hot day. So here's what happens when most trees get hit with drought conditions. Now these photographs, I'll just explain briefly. This is one of my ex-students in Hobart who's just brilliant at this stuff. He's got a method going where you can take a photograph of a section through a tree trunk without actually physically damaging the tree. So these are like X-rays. And so there's sections through the trunk starting from the left, going across to the right. The white dots you can see on the left are the conducting elements in the stem. So that's where the water's going up through a lot of different channels, all microscopic. And then as a tree gets droughted, these elements start to cavitate, so they lose their water supply. So one by one, they just stop transporting water and they fill up with air. So when they're black there, they're full of air, they're not full of water anymore, and that's no longer a pathway for water for that tree. And you can see that as you go from the left to the right and the conditions get worse and worse, more and more of the elements in the tree cavitate, and by the time you get to the third photograph there, the tree is effectively dead. That's it for the tree. And the tree on the right is what it looks like when it's all over. So what trees do, they play a game of how they want to deal with water stress. And so they have these conducting elements. If you look at a piece of wood, you can't see them, but there's thousands of them inside the wood. They're microscopic, so they have great surface tension, and you get this capillary action. So the reason that trees can be so tall is that they've got this enormous capillary action going on inside them, and water can be drawn up. It's sucked up from the top, and it can be sucked up through many tens of metres. And you can only do that if you've got really tiny diameter vessels. If a tree wants to be really efficient at getting water up, it makes the vessels as wide as it can. Because that means the water travels more freely and more water can get up to the top of the tree. So that's what you've got up on the top left. You have wider elements, the water moves more quickly. When there's plenty of water around, that tree grows faster. Down at the bottom right, you've got the really narrow ones, and those trees are taking a safety first approach to it. So those trees can cope with really tough conditions because they've got really narrow elements and it's really hard to cavitate them. It takes a lot of energy to get the water out of those elements. So trees that sit to the bottom right do really well in extreme drought conditions, but they don't grow very fast. You know, they tend to be pretty scrawny looking trees. So somewhere we've got to get data like this for hundreds of different species and make our decisions based on what we know is the reality of how these trees operate, as opposed to the kind of, the current approach is put lots of trees in the ground and watch them for 20 years and see what happens. And look, it's all we've got, and I'm sure that's probably what Stefan largely, I know Stefan was talking to you before, and I know Stefan well. There is value in that approach, but we've got to go well beyond it if we're going to really solve the problem. Here's what happens to that tree as it dies. So I don't get into too much detail, but if you look at the light blue line, the first thing plants do when they're put under stress is the stomates on the leaves, the little pores, close up. And so you can see how the blue line goes from the top there where you've got lots of water coming out of the plant. They shut up and it drops right down to a low level. At the same time, the red line, when it's down the bottom, the tree's happy and healthy. As it goes up, it's getting into more and more trouble, and about halfway up that steep incline, the tree dies. That's when it's all over. So obviously the plan we have to have is trees that don't reach that point. I'll go through this a bit quickly. I think I'm over talking this, but when you stress a plant, it can recover quite quickly without any damage. That's the tree at the top. It can suffer some damage and take longer to recover, but it will recover. Or eventually you can damage it so much that it'll either take years to recover or it'll die. And again, that carbon loss and the carbon cost of doing that is something we've got to be very aware of in choosing what trees we decide to put into urban environments. I won't dwell on this diagram, this photo, just to say that trees are complicated, and there's lots of different aspects to trees that you have to take into account when you're trying to work out which are the right ones to put in the right places. It's not just one or two things you're measuring, it's a really complicated business. And here's what it looks like in action. This is a photograph taken by my ex-student, Tim Broderick. This is in New South Wales following a drought. So that was a eucalypt forest with a patch of calitris in the middle. And there's a really good example of how you've got native vegetation, you put it under extreme drought, two different species react in two completely different ways. The eucalypts die. Eucalypts tend to just transpire themselves to death. They don't have a strategy, they just keep doing it, and they keep hoping they can draw water from deep in the soil. Calitris is probably the most drought-tolerant tree on the planet. And there's places in South Australia now where they're starting to die out, so we've got some serious issues. But it's just a nice example of how different species react in very different ways, even in natural vegetation. This is a diagram that was put together in Sydney a few years ago. The title of the paper is "The Angriest Summer on Record." And each of those vertical bars is a different species of tree that's growing in urban Sydney. And where it's green, it's in good condition. And where it goes yellow, then orange, then black, it's getting worse and worse and worse. So over on the left is the species that have the most trees that were either mildly damaged or seriously damaged or killed as a result of that drought. Now, I'm sure you can't see that very well, but let me just read off at the top. We've got Platanus is the worst one, then Acer, then Magnolia, then Quercus, then Pyrrhus, then Malus, and so on. And if I read from the bottom up, there's a couple of European ones there, but then there's Melaleuca, Eucalyptus, 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 Cupaniopsis, Corymbia, Corymbia. It's all Australian natives. Down the far right, where things were fine, and up the top left, it's all the European and North American natives, which we brought with us when we settled Australia because it made it feel like home. That's why we have those trees in our environment. So it's a pretty clear message what we should be doing. I won't dwell on this one, except maybe I'll just focus on the top one here. This was a really important paper that I came across. In southwestern Australia, they did some research on some native vegetation, a Sclerophyllus mallee heathland. After 2 successive days of extreme temperatures above 45 degrees, they had high temperatures and hot winds, resulting in adult mortality and extensive crown damage. So there you've got what looks like tough as old boots vegetation, which has evolved into a high temperature, low water environment. But if you take that vegetation out of its temperature range, it still just dies off. You can't assume that you can go to these places and find a solution. You have to do the hard work to make sure you've got plants that are going to be suitable for the kind of environment that you're going to go into. I won't go on to the second one, it's getting a bit intense for that, but you get the message. Now this example, again, it starts out being for Europe, and this is what tree mortality looks like. This is in 2018 in a drought in European forests. And you can see what happens when trees aren't happy. They just drop dead and go brown. So it's pretty clear which are the dead trees and which are the live ones. And this seemed to have been pretty typical for what happens in Europe. But a few years ago, this is the street that I live in, and these are Norfolk Island pines. Look at that one about halfway down and compare that to the trees in Europe that died as a result of drought. That tree there almost certainly died as a result of the millennial drought back about a decade ago. It took a long time, but it died. And I'm pretty confident that's what happened, so they just cut it down and put another one in. If you look along the coast, the Norfolk Island pines are in terrible trouble. They're often put in really narrow little plots. and most of them look like they're dead on their feet. They're not having a happy time. It's a really interesting example of a tree that looks very tough, but Norfolk Island has a temperature of about 26 degrees every day and it rains a lot. It's not a place where you'd expect to find an especially tough tree, and you don't. And then compare that with this. This is a newspaper article from a little while ago, 2020. You've got those two eucalypts next to each other, one dead, one alive, and of course all the claims, and maybe it's true, is that that plant was poisoned, but maybe it just died from drought as well. We just haven't done the work to know exactly what the impact is going to be. Now that's a eucalypt, so if that one's died from drought, we do have some problems, but some eucalypts are quite susceptible if it gets dry enough, along with the heat. So just to recap where I've been, in the past our focus has been on that slight shift in temperatures, or moderate shift in temperatures, around the mean temperature. When in fact, this is where we've got to focus if we're going to make any progress into the future. What happens when we get the days of extreme heat? What should we do? Earlier this year there was a parliamentary inquiry into the urban forest run by Jane Stinson, who's, I don't know if she's this electorate, but she's Badco, wherever that might be, somewhere in here. She's done an excellent job of this, and she just recently produced their first set of recommendations. And some of the things, this is what I put to them as what I thought they should do. Produce a community education plan to properly explain the risks we're facing and the solutions to them. I think the kinds of examples I've given here tonight just aren't well understood. People think they know about climate change, but it's a lot worse. It's just a lot worse than people think it's going to be. We need to properly value urban vegetation to take away the easy option for its removal. It's disgraceful how cheap it is to remove trees. And it is interesting that in the preliminary report that they put out from the parliamentary inquiry, they've effectively suggested multiplying that by 10. So we're finally getting some action that might make a difference. We need to coordinate the many individual plans for monitoring and long-term testing of trees. Every council in Greater Adelaide is worried about trees. Almost none of the councils talk to each other. They all have their own plan, they're all good, but there's no coordinated effort, and the state government really should step in and do this. We've got to have coordination so we're not wasting all the different bits of information that are being gathered out there. Because I'm making a plug for myself here, developing a world-class research facility. But I do think we need that. It won't be me, but I hope someone else can do that to really properly monitor the urban vegetation that we've got and to evaluate new species. We just don't have the right ones out there. It's really scary. I mean, we could have our first 50-degree centigrade days this year, this summer. If we do, I hate to think what the headlines might be about how the vegetation looks in the days following. It could be catastrophic. And we need some kind of peak body. I think this should be state government that pulls the information together and provides coherent advice about what we should be doing across the board. Above all, we need, point one there, we need an education plan. People need to understand what they're facing, because at the moment I don't think the message is getting through to enough people. Does that mean? Yeah. And as I said, we could have our first 50-degree days anytime, and it won't surprise me if it's this summer. The solutions aren't always easy to find. I mean, it's quite interesting when you start digging around in the councils, just some of the things that go on. There's a plane tree that's growing in an inner city area where there's lots of services underground. Some councils will spend up to $17,000 to put that tree in the ground because it's so hard to get the root system into a place where it's going to survive well. So that's what it takes to get a plane tree in the ground that's only about 2 metres tall. We've got lots of work going on. It's quite tedious in many ways. If you want to measure what trees are doing, you have to start before dawn, and because trees fill up with water during the night, and then they lose it during the day. So you've got to be out there measuring. This is some work we did for Adelaide City Council on their plane trees a few years ago, and we're hoping to continue that into the future. But it's you need to be well organised to do this stuff, and it's moderately expensive to do as well. And then finally, just a plug for one of our programs. Last year we launched a program called Trees for Good at Alberton Primary School, and we had lots of partners. They're listed down the bottom there. What we did was we went out into the school and provided trees that were about 1.5 metres tall, about 35 of them. The children out there planted the trees. We gave them quite significant education on how trees work and what they should be measuring. And then they measured a whole lot of very simple features of the tree. And then at intervals, every 6 months at the moment, they measure them again and they provide the data to us. We develop a database showing which species are working, which ones aren't, how it goes through time, and we want it to be a forever project. One of the really major problems we've got with a lot of tree planting projects at present is the trees get planted, they get looked after for a year or two, then everybody walks away and you end up with a tree graveyard. A lot of trees die before they get a chance to establish because you don't have some kind of attempt to follow up, and that's what we're trying to develop with this particular program. And that's it.
Well, I'm sure there are plenty of questions, so who would like to go first? Thank you.
Can I just say, in support of what you just said, we were in Gippsland on the 1st of October.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
We had a fire
Yep.
that burned 17,000 hectares, which was equivalent to a February fire on the 1st of October. And a day later, we had 100 mil of rain. So it was quite a catastrophic moment. But, you know, we're all adults in this room, and what you've told us is quite despairing. And as mature adults, it's quite hard for us probably to internalise it and come to some terms with it. So the question is, how do we explain this to young children in such a way that they're empowered to go forward to try and resolve this problem in their lifetime?
Yeah, it's a good question. And look, I agonise over that a lot. Back when climate change first started becoming a serious issue, there were two things that happened amongst the people that were pushing the case that we had a problem on our hands. One was they all agreed that they would never talk about the population growth, that they would ignore that issue. And the second one was that they would always try and put a positive spin on the story they were telling. And they failed dismally in getting the message across because of that. That's why I'm not bothered about coming here and giving you the grim reality, because that's how it's going to be. I mean, I wish I knew the answer, and I'm not an early childhood education specialist, so I'm not going to tell you I know the answer to that. But I do know that there's no point lying to people. You know, we've got to find a way to get the truth across without making it so despairing that you can't be bothered trying. I mean, we don't want to do that. But we certainly, the attempts to try and sugarcoat climate change failed dismally, in my opinion.
Someone else? Yep.
Great talk, really loved it. Right in the beginning you focused quite extensively on population growth. I totally agree with you. I started my career when the world's population was just under half what it is now.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're living with, and you know that. We all know that. And I'm not putting my hand up yet to exit, but on the serious note, I agree with your strategy and all that sort of stuff you're outlining about these are the things we need to do and not sugarcoat it. But a huge issue for me, and a sense of great powerlessness, is how you shift this economic paradigm of population growth equals the way to go, right? And part of it, I think, is raw political power and those who have the ears of those who make the policies. And somehow we need a critical mass as well as the research to say you can have a circular economy. One thing, for example, a minor thing that occurred the other day, would that legislation is brought in so that everything that is made in for domestic use is repairable, for example, right? Start with things you can actually do and then use that as a stalking horse for going into other more contentious areas, because growth is just not going to... Have a look what we're doing on the plains, we're building on the most fertile land, you know, etc., etc.
Yeah, no, look, I agree. The other point I should make, and I'm not well prepared for this, so I can't remember his name, but there was I think Swedish population expert who unfortunately died a few years ago, and he was doing an analysis of human population growth across different countries in the world. And he came up with a startling sort of almost revelation that when you can reduce infant mortality below a certain percentage, the birth rate plummets.
Yeah.
So in every country that he measured it, that's what happened. As soon as you got the juvenile death rate to a low level, people stopped having large numbers of children. And in many countries now, the population is declining because of that. And so there is some hope that it's taken care of itself. I think the only place it's not happening now is Africa.
Yeah.
Even in India, the population is now declining. So there are some signs that things are improving there. But I mean, the other problem, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, is it's not just population growth, it's increases in standard of living.
Oh yeah.
So,
yeah.
you know, there's two of us living in a 4-bedroom house. That's my guilt, if you like. I've got lots of friends who are single and live in 3-bedroom houses.
Yeah.
Now, our standard of living is colossal, and we can't afford to keep having that. That's got to catch us eventually. So, I'm not suggesting you all go out and change your standard of living, but it is a reality that it's not just population growth, but it's the standard of living across the globe that's getting us.
You showed us before a map, a graph, 800,000 years ago, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Carbon dioxide levels went from 280 points to 400 in the past million, has gone exponential. So assuming we can do the right thing and we get the thing under control, when into the future would we bring it back to 200 parts per billion?
I think the only way that can happen is if we have some really significant technological breakthroughs. I mean, I'm not a technological person. I don't particularly look for technological solutions. But the only way I can see that happening is, in Europe, for instance, now, they've got quite large-scale machines that pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turn it into plastics. So you can buy plastics made out of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Now that's taking a problem and turning it into a resource. They'll be having no impact at the moment on atmospheric carbon dioxide, but if you can figure out how to do it on a large enough scale, you might, because I think the chances of doing it by any natural means is about zero.
We're talking 300 years out into the future, or so.
Well, see, one of the problems, I mean, trees are a really good example. If you look at the impact, there used to be a lot of trees on the planet, a lot more than there are now, and they did their job. The human interaction with trees is that we see trees as an exploitable resource. So we use them for fuel, we use them for construction, and now we're talking about using them for shade and for lowering temperatures. But we see trees very much as a resource that we're allowed to exploit. And we've done that for centuries. You can't turn that around in 10 or 20 or 30 years when the population's bigger than it's ever been. It's just an impossible task. So you've got to find another way to do it, I think. Sadly, I wish I could give you a better answer than that. I don't think that's feasible.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'd just like to ask Jan to give a vote of thanks for our speaker.
Thank you, Bob, for coming tonight. In our 25th year, in our, I think it was our 13th season of the Public Talks program, and you've been before, and we've enjoyed your talk then. On a personal note, the value of trees, I can recall that 2019 day. I was driving along Goulburn Road. I've got a little temperature gauge in my car, and it was on 46 degrees as we came through the parklands. As we progressed along Goulburn Road, it went up, and when I stopped at the light somewhere in Goulburn Road, it went up to 49. Oh, I thought, I've never seen that before. I went through the viaduct, and it actually hit 50. And I was, wow, I couldn't take a picture of that one because I wasn't at the stoplight. As I turned into Clarence Park, where I live, by the time I got home, the temperature gauge on the car was back to 47, 46. And I thought, that's the difference between living in a suburb, Clowns Park, lots of trees, as against going along Goodwood Road with all these buildings and things. And to me, that was a defining moment in terms of this area, this tree, this Clowns Park, where all these trees are, is really important. And we should really encourage all the suburbs to have lots of trees. So to me, that's a personal story because of the little temperature gauge on my car. It does have a little snowflake when you go under minus, up to sort of 2 or 3 degrees. But that's another story. But thank you, Bob. I think you've opened our, I guess we're all concerned and know, but this has put it into perspective in terms of the practical, the trees, why they're important, and the reasons why. And maybe some of the things we can do to lobby governments into the population growth as against the economics, this sort of balance that perhaps that's one thing we could possibly work individually at with governments, whether we can, I don't know. But I appreciate you coming tonight. Delightful to have you tonight, and thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Jan. Thank you very much, Bob.